Welcome to the Root of All Evil podcast, where every week we tackle topical and controversial issues by researching primary sources like legal decisions, raw data, other source material to improve our bullshit radar and become better informed citizens. I'm Luke.
And I'm Joe.
So let's get into it. Joe, today I wanted to share with you some of the results of some thought experiments and research I did with regard to government organizations, their legal backing, and potential waste. So I want to pretend that
hot topic.
Yeah, I want to pretend that we are the head of DOGE and tasked with recommending to the president what to cut. So, how would we start a project like that? What questions would we ask? What are Elon and Vivek going to be doing? But first, just to lay out my own baggage, to be honest with you, going into this last election, I was a single issue voter. And my issue is to just balance the budget. The fact that we can't come close to a balanced budget since the late 1990s, despite our being in peacetime and despite a growing economy, is maddening to me. It is so incredibly bonkers that I struggle to take our government seriously. It's starting to get into this questioning their legitimacy territory for me personally.
And not even balancing the budget, but just decreasing the ever increasing trajectory of more and more debt.
It drives me nuts. They are forfeiting their own authority when they want to tell us what the country collectively should and shouldn't do, what individuals should and shouldn't do, but they can't just do a basic thing like balance the budget. They can collect over $4 trillion in revenue, and they can't get their house in order enough to actually just balance the budget. And it drives me nuts. And so if any candidate could credibly promise to balance the budget, I would almost certainly vote for that person. No one ran on that. And even among those two candidates, frankly, if they said they would, I don't know how credible it would be. And
every politician ever talks about doing things like that.
Yeah, they don't talk about cuts anymore. It's all just spend. It's all just Christmas. Come every election,
you'll get more free stuff.
Vote for me. I'll give you some more money. So this is a big reason, as you know, why I wanted to start this podcast with you. I wanted to have kind of a productive outlet for this strange mess of curiosity and outrage that I feel. I mean, what the hell is going on with government spending? Is it incompetence? Is it corruption?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, though, in most countries nowadays are very much in debt. It's kind of a global phenomenon in a sense, but that doesn't mean you have to follow it that way.
Yeah, and totally. I agree. And, anyways, so this DOGE initiative is the single most exciting thing to me with the incoming administration. So this is the announcement. Say what you want about Trump. He definitely has its own writing style. He's got his own tone, particularly with the use of, capital letters. The great Elon Musk, the gem.
I love the emphasis.
The gem, if you will. And Vivek, who apparently was not deserving of the great title.
Great Elon, just
great
Vivek.
Elon and American Patriot, They're going to lead DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency. So my question is, how much money could DOGE, so it's just a few outside consultants and the president, really, how much could they cut at the limit, at the maximum amount? We know the legislative branch controls the purse strings. So what could this department, and it's a fake department, by the way, departments have to come by some sort of legal passing. They're not doing that. They're really just external consultants. How much could they really accomplish? And I'm going to operate for the purposes of this thought experiment that they don't need to pass any new laws. What can the president do unilaterally to decrease government expenditures? Also, there are a lot of other things that they promised, including cutting back on regulations, which I'm not going to try and cover, at least not in this episode. Reducing spending is really what I'm interested in. So I guess the first thing to understand in this process is the battlefield, right? What is the government organization chart at the department level? So here is the U.S. federal government, the three branches, we are all familiar with. In blue, we have the legislative, the executive in red, and then the judicial in yellow. The big thing that stands out to me is the amount of red here. The amount of departments under the president is a lot. And the cabinet that the president puts in place are the heads of each of these departments. So we got 15, I think I found, executive departments, which comprise the cabinet. I'll just run through them real quick. We have the secretaries of agriculture, commerce, defense, education, energy, health and human services, homeland security, housing and urban development, interior, labor, state, transportation, treasury, veterans affairs, and the attorney general. Now, just to kind of close the loop on this, there are a few other positions like the chief of staff, the ambassador to the UN, among others that are technically, I guess, part of the cabinet. But just for the sake of the department heads, this is what we're looking at. So that seems like a lot just on first glance, and I asked myself, just for fun, which one of these are the most critical. But I had an idea to compare this cabinet to the small council on Game of Thrones. Just to compare. So that's what I did. In their small council, they had a hand of the king. Let's call that the vice president. They had a master of coin over here. That's the treasurer. They had a master of whisperers. It's intelligence. They had war. It's defense. Laws. That's the attorney general. Then they had a master of ships, commander of the King's Guard, which is the military advisor. Let's roll that in with the DOD. And then a Grand Maester, and that's basically the science advisor. And I think the Grand Maester, I think we could probably say is Google or something. It's a library. It's just a walking library. That's, I think, what the Grand Maester is. So at a minimum, according to fantasy fiction, I think we need a vice president, treasurer, intelligence, defense, and attorney general. But let me stop there just for a second. What do you think? Like, if we could, would you just want to delete everything except those departments?
I mean, it's especially coming from the Elon Musk perspective, it seems enticing to do that, but it's a country's not like a company where you kind of build it up from nothing. Like you start with this large mass of all these people doing all these crazy things, living their life, and you have to put some kind of boundaries across it. So it's difficult to try to say it's like, this area could have been redesigned better, but it's you don't have control over what it's exercising authority over. But that said, I'm not sure. What do you think?
Yeah. I thought about this. I think, people, if you were to propose just like deleting everything except those departments, just as an extreme, we live in a more complex time. This isn't medieval Europe, obviously. Societies now are more complex, and maybe a government organization should reflect that. But then on the other hand, it's like, well, I think that a measure of society is not necessarily the size or the complexity of its government. I would like to break the connection between having a bigger government somehow correlates with a better or more powerful country. And that just doesn't ring true to me.
Right. And that's something strange. That's like a general trend that's been occurring in the US in recent years.
Yeah, no, it's been happening. If you kind of were to try to factor in the size of the US government, like prior to the Civil War, it was basically non-existent. It was able to fund itself entirely with just like tariffs or something, right? If you look at just the history of the size of the US government, it's grown tremendously. I would think, like, if you brought George Washington back here today and you told him that we were spending 20% or whatever it is of GDP at the federal government level, his head would explode. But it's just kind of been this gradual thing, generation by generation.
To what extent in this modern age do you require more resources, though? You think about things like the interstate highway system, for example, in the 50s, like that couldn't have been built without the government, and something Civil War era, certainly Founding Fathers era, the scale of that kind of infrastructure project just didn't exist. So there's some level of nowadays. It seems to me like it, compared to then, it needs to be larger. But as a percentage of GDP, yeah, 20%. Um, I'd be interested to see like what that number was.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, that's a good point. And as I was mentioning, as societies get more complex, it makes sense that a government would sort of grow with it. The other half of this is that the executive branch, kind of what I was thinking, this org chart is really more of a reflection on the amount of regulations, I guess, and laws that are being passed. So, if we go back to the legislative branch is what's actually passing the laws, the executive branch is set up to enforce them. So maybe this is, not really the fact that the executive branch has so many departments is not the underlying cause, but it's just the symptom. Maybe the issue is with the regulations. I don't know.
Yeah, did you see something? Actually, Elon and Vivek published something in the Wall Street Journal today, basically just giving a high level overview of what they're trying to do here. But a very central part of it was describing the tool with which they're saying they're going to do what they're going to do was very focused on regulation. And one of the main points they were making was that over the years, these regulations have just been growing and growing, and somehow over time, Congress is kind of I forget exactly how he said it, but the point was these regulations weren't approved by Congress. They weren't laws signed in by elected officials. They're regulations written down by bureaucrats, and there's tens of thousands of them, thousands created every year, and they're just getting bigger and bigger, and they're all kind of small and innocuous things, but altogether, it becomes paralyzing. And they're made by people that aren't elected. It's just
Yeah.
bureaucrats, and their jobs are based upon writing reports and whatever they do all day. The more regulations you have to enforce, the more you have to do at your job. I don't know, the safer you are, the more you can advocate for more government spending. And so their point was they want to get in there and just as a starting point, just cut out a substantial amount of the regulations that were not created by Congress, not created by elected officials.
That's a good point. And I did run into that a bit, and we're going to touch upon that somewhat and one thing that I saw here was that some of these departments, and the department that we're going to dive into today, it's the Department of Education, I think have a mind of their own. They've kind of become their own living and breathing organisms. And part of that is just kind of this gradual outward push of their authority and what they do. And part of even what the DOE is doing is actually telling them how to interpret the law or how to interpret certain things. So now that we got the lay of the land, let's see what has already been written on the topic. So no doubt there's been a lot of work already done on how to shrink government spending. Maybe I could just piggyback, or maybe Elon and Vivek could just piggyback on that work. Let's just see what's already out there. So there's no shortage of stuff. One that was quite in depth was from the CATO organization. So that's an organization that, in their own words, quote, creates a presence for and promotes libertarian ideas and policy debates, end quote. So FYI on their biases. They are libertarians. They like smaller governments. And for even more disclosure, and if it wasn't obvious already, and probably as you know, I do lean a little bit libertarian. Anyways, they wrote a detailed blog. I'm going to link to that here, where they propose a 10-year plan to bring spending down to be in balance. So to be in balance with revenues. That's sort of what this chart is. And I just kind of looked through it a little bit. I just kind of wanted to present this as a sense of a literature review as what's out there already. They divide it by department. So, or even at the broader level, they go for mandatory spending programs. So stuff like healthcare, Social Security Administration. They have the broader topic here. And then they have the spending reform. And then the amount that they'll save, they think. Now, the next table is going to be on discretionary. So these are discretionary programs that they're proposing to curtail, and farm subsidies, telecom subsidies, and these aid to the states. So they're proposing 1.188 A trillion annually. I guess annual savings by 2032. So however you want to interpret that. Um, I guess if we
Oh,
started today,
okay. Yeah, I see
it would get
this.
to that amount.
Yeah, which
Um,
is interesting. So that's, I would imagine that's like one of the most aggressive uh, pieces out there because I've never heard, like in the mainstream, people talking about order of trillions in savings in the government today. But now with this new department, they're saying they're gonna what 2 trillion
two
in
trillion.
like
Yeah, I
a
think that's on the
year and a half.
2 trillion.
So something pretty substantially different here.
So the next one here is from the Congressional Budget Office. So this is a governmental organization that has been tasked with reducing government spending. As if it were the bureaucrats offering up pieces of themselves to be eaten or something to be sacrificed. So let's look at the document. I don't think I need to go much further than the table of contents, kind of to make my point. Make this a bit bigger. Some of the similarities with the Cato Institute, just in the way that they organized it. We got mandatory spending options, discretionary spending options. I think this also has a 10-year time frame for the plan. One of the big differences here is there's a chapter 4, right? Revenue options. So those are taxes. Cato is most certainly not proposing more taxes. That is counter to the libertarian ethos. Now, my instincts generally, because I started out, are to agree. I think they should be able to cover everything in 4 trillion. I'm not saying cut taxes, just keep them where they are, but just balance the budget. Now, if you're to look at the listings here, so we are kind of at a sub table of contents and just kind of looking at them. They also go by department as seemingly, kind of loosely. And if we were just read them, eliminate this agriculture program, reduce subsidies, the limit the payments, remove this cap on interest rates for student loans, things like that. Kind of going down here, discretionary spending. I like this one. It's just straight up reduce the DOD's budget.
Like it seems what the DOGE is recommending is far more aggressive. These more traditional outlets are taking these very comprehensive views and trying to like almost like surgically go into all of these organizations and like what are some of the edges we can kind of nudge in the right direction to push the overall, which that's definitely a valid way of doing it. It seems very resource intensive in itself to go through all of these different organizations, different I would imagine different wings of all these different of all the individual departments and try to push things, bring resources down. And it's not an easy thing to tell people you're downsizing their budget. Certainly, it's not an easy conversation to have to say that you're firing people. And just there's this general idea that government employees can't really get fired. And that's a topic though that transcends this country, this time period. That's just kind of always how it is, and like it's it always will be that way. Public versus private. That is what it is.
Yeah, I exactly. I think the idea of just saying, okay, lay off a whole bunch of people, you're not really going to find that in here. Maybe you sort of flirt with it, like when they start talking about just reducing the DoD's
Right.
budget. But the idea of just either like cutting an entire department or whole chunks or
Mm-hmm.
offices within them is
Like no politician could ever say that. Politicians are all. It's like we need to increase defense spending. We need to increase educational spending. Even if they want to cut the budget, it's you have to focus on helping people and not cutting people's jobs.
right. I mean, to cut off like huge chunks of themselves is sort of beyond their imaginative faculties. Sure, they can kind of put together this pretty report together. There's clearly a lot of thought into this. A lot of work has been done in order to put this report. It's a nice report. But
Right, but
and I
how many
have to
people
imagine
over
that
how
the
many
people,
hours?
yeah, And I have to imagine that somebody in there was thinking kind of the same thing I was, which is like, look, if you really wanted to reduce this thing, this is what you would do. But to
Flip
also be
around.
in their shoes, imagine trying to propose that to their boss or something, who has to feed their family with a bureaucratic paycheck,
Right.
and it just wouldn't fly. And that's where it would die or something. Anyway.
Yeah. I don't want to take us off on a tangent, but I think also something just in the background. I think you see this a lot in the Democratic Party itself. Like it's kind of one of its core principles nowadays is just the like overarching kind of Keynesian economic view nowadays, in that government spending is a good thing. The more government spending you have, the more economic stimulation you have, the more growth you have, the more jobs you create, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it seems like we've kind of pushed that to its breaking point because we've had these, because the core pieces were over the financial crisis. Keynes wrote, people in power during the financial crisis studied the Great Depression, and the idea was that there wasn't enough spending. If the government would have spent more, we could have avoided all of this. So that's what they did in 2009, and there was reasonable success. And now they just did it again a few years ago over COVID, and now there's some more negative outcomes. So we had inflation, and now maybe we're hitting a breaking point in terms of just how far the next government dollar can really provide benefit.
Yeah, no, that's a good
Anyway,
point. I don't think
that's
that's
my
too far of a
tangent.
description. I mean, that's true. A lot of government spending got us out of the Depression. It was the first thing that was turned to after the 2008 financial crisis, and it's just like the first thing that they did after COVID. And to your
It was like a
point,
knee-jerk reaction for COVID.
it was so fast. I mean, they couldn't wait to spend the money. It couldn't come out
Mm-hmm.
fast. I've never seen government move that fast.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Nor the Fed.
yeah, agreed. And just kind of go back to the question that I had when I looked into this is like, can we just piggyback off of this? And can we just use it going forward? I think the answer is no. I would say this is not the DOGE way.
Yeah.
Vivek and Elon would look at this and say, what is this garbage? Cutting
Right.
spending over 10 years. No.
How
We're
many
doing
people
it.
did it take to write
We're
this?
doing it in a year. Let's go.
Right.
Um, delete, and then see what we have to put back. That's kind of what I see happening. So,
Yeah, really, just
again,
a totally different approach.
yeah, it didn't answer the question which I had, which is just what is the maximum amount we could cut, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, where is the edge of impossible here? Where does possible end and impossible begin? So, obviously the federal government is very large. I couldn't do the whole thing. And kind of on this podcast, we like to go as deep as possible, the most concrete kind of source data. So I just grabbed a single department and started drilling down. So let's look at the Department of Education. I chose that since it's kind of been on the chopping block lately. And my limiting factor here in answering the question of how much could we cut is the law. And for this thought exercise, I'm going to assume that the Republicans did not have control of Congress. But I suspect even with control this time around, it would take a long time, certainly by Elon and Vivek's standards, to get something done there. So let's just see what we can advise the president to do alone. And my approach was, A, what is the DOE required to do by law? What is it actually doing? And then C, I would just propose cutting the delta, right? Cut the delta. Cut the parts that Congress did not tell it to do, trim the fat, curtail the overreach, whatever you want to call it.
Seems like a pretty reasonable approach.
I think, your idea of basically trying to identify, maybe it's similar, maybe I'm giving myself too much credit, but the way that, in that Wall Street Journal article, which I did not read, so thanks for telling me about that. I'll have to go check that out. Basically identifying where, government departments are just sort of adding their own regulations on top of stuff that's not supposed to be there. Legislative branch, the courts, they do the laws. The executive branch does not.
Yeah, and so in fact, actually, just to reference that Elon and Vivek piece again that was in the Wall Street Journal, one of the things that they wrote was it was really contingent on two of these recent court cases that effectively takes power away from some of these agencies in enforcing some of their own regulations. And so part of what they said was our North Star for reform will be the U.S. Constitution with a focus on two critical Supreme Court rulings issued during President Biden's tenure. The first is West Virginia versus the EPA. The justices held that agencies can't impose regulations dealing with major economic or policy questions unless Congress specifically authorizes them to do so. And then in Loper Bright Raimondo, the Chevron case, the court overturned the Chevron doctrine and held that federal courts should no longer defer to federal agencies' interpretation of the law or their own rulemaking authority. And then they say, together, these cases suggest that a plethora of current federal regulations exceed the authority that Congress has granted under the law. So they've kind of identified this really interesting legal framework that it seems like they could do quite a bit through.
And the next slide here is let's look then at what defines the bedrock of this thought experiment, right? So let's look at the law which established the DOE. So I pulled the Department of Education Organization Act. So that was first approved in 1979. It has been amended, and the PDF that I found included amendments as it's written here through 2022. Now, I don't know how many acts of law that you've read. I am not a lawyer, but as you know, I did used to work as a bank regulator, and I looked at regulations regularly at my job. And they would have it would be formatted like this, right? They would have a section, then they have parts, A, 1, capital A, I. And often kind of if I was examining whether a bank complied with a certain regulation, I would rewrite the regulation into a note form first. So that would let me, read it very closely. And then as I was going through it, I would essentially take notes and I would reformat it. So that's what I did here. So in this Excel table, I'm going to be doing a few things. The most obvious, what is formatting? We can just visually see, sections and, subsections, and then things like subsections down here, A1 to AI and stuff. The other thing I'm able to do is to eliminate a lot of words. I can summarize certain clauses, or I can leave them out entirely if I deem it irrelevant to what I'm using it for. So that's what we're looking at. This is the law. Most of it is the exact language from it. This is the root of the DOE, so to speak. Now let's start just with Title I, the general provisions. I wanted to see what is like the spirit of the DOE. And the spirit of the DOE can kind of be found just in this section 101 and 102. So 101 is the findings. The findings sort of gives the underlying reasons for the act. Why is it necessary at all? And in here, I think some of these will look pretty reasonable. We find that education is important. There's a continuing need for ensure equal access. One thing that stuck out to me was this third. So it says in the act that parents have the primary responsibility for the education of their children. And states, localities and private institutions have the primary responsibility for supporting that parental role. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, what does that mean exactly?
The primary responsibility for education is from the parents, right? It's not the federal government. It's not even the states. It's the parents. I just kind of thought that was interesting. And, they sort of reiterate that if the, part 3 wasn't clear enough, they say it in 4 again. The primary public responsibility for education reserved to the states. But this is what I wanted to focus on, the purposes. So now we are explicitly stating what is the purpose of this department. We're going to spend some time here. Strengthen the federal commitment to ensuring access to equal educational opportunity. Okay, fine.
Sounds pretty reasonable.
Supplement and complement the efforts of states. Okay. Encourage the increased involvement of the public, parents, and students in federal education programs. I wasn't totally sure what this meant. I don't know what federal education programs are. But nevertheless, it's pretty weak language. Encourage the increased involvement.
Yeah, I mean, even the one just before it, supplement and complement. That sounds pretty weak. pretty vague and pretty weak. Like
Yeah.
you really take that in a lot of
Yeah, I
directions.
got that same impression when I was reading this. This is not super strong language here. Promote improvements in the quality and usefulness of education.
We
Improve the
we,
coordination of federal education programs. Improve the management and efficiency of federal education activities, right? Especially with respect to process, procedures, and administration structures. Okay, efficiency. Increase the accountability of federal education programs, right? I mean, compare that with something like, write new laws or enforce stuff, right? No, that's not
right.
written here.
Create a school system.
Right. Yeah. Establish schools and force people to go there and learn stuff that we tell them. It's
Yeah.
not in there. Um,
Encourage, involve, or like the one, promote improvements. We don't deliver improvements here. We just promote them.
right.
It'd be nice if you did this, but that's up to you.
Kind of let's scroll down. Let's look at kind of 103. So this is, again, they want to reiterate the fact the establishment, I'll read down here, the establishment of the Department of Education shall not increase the authority of the federal government over education or diminish the responsibility for education which is reserved to the states and the local school systems. When I read this, it was just sort of like an exclamation point, underline, bold, like this department is not to step on the toes of the states, right? Like, I can imagine some, politicking going on here, like when they were trying to get this passed. And if, I don't know, if Democrats tried to pass it, there were Republicans being, you got to put in language in here that says you're not going to step on the rules of the states, right? And that's like what this is. I mean, that's section 1. But again, kind of the question that we are faced with here is what is like the bare minimum that the DOE has to do? And that takes us to the Title II. And what this is doing is just establishing, by law, who has to work there. So let's just kind of take a look at this. At minimum, that you need to have a secretary of education. You need to have some officers. You need a deputy secretary. And then it says sort of what some of their responsibilities are. In the department, you should have an assistant secretary, and they list out some of these sub offices, which are, they go into more detail later into the act as to what they do. Well, they're saying an assistant secretary for elementary and secondary education, post-secondary education, career, technical, and adult education, special education and rehabilitative services, civil rights, general counsel. You can look at it. So, okay, so we're getting closer just in terms of, the bare minimum of what they have to do. But the question that I still had is like, what exactly are these offices to do? What do they do? So now we get to section 203. So now we're actually talking about the offices. And this is the entire language for the office, this bit that I have here. And it defines, as far as I could tell, the Office for Civil Rights. So in section 203, it's pretty short. Also, just, hand on heart, I dug into this one only because it was the first one that they listed. Okay, it's not like I'm trying to fight against this. But this is very important. They say, and I'm going to read this. The Office for Civil Rights. The Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights shall make an annual report to the Secretary, the President, and the Congress summarizing the compliance and enforcement activities of the Office for Civil Rights and identifying significant civil rights or compliance problems as to which such office has made a recommendation for their corrective action, and as to which, in the judgment of the Assistant Secretary, adequate progress is not being made. So I got a little hung up here because they're using the words compliance and enforcement. But then it says you summarize these activities in the annual report. So we're going to dive into this actual report in a second. But I think this is one of the biggest hung-ups that I'm getting. If you go down farther, you can say like what they're authorized to do. And it sounds, this is pretty, again, not a lawyer, but it seems pretty straightforward. They are to collect or coordinate the collection of data necessary to ensure compliance with civil rights. Okay. Select, appoint, and employ such officers and employees, right, necessary to carry out the functions. Fine. enter into contracts and other arrangements for audits, studies, analyses, and other services to make such payments as may be necessary. And then this is just kind of, I guess, some legal stuff, not very important. But this is interesting. I mean, they make reports, but here they also say that they summarize the compliance and enforcement activities for their office. So is like the DOE an enforcement agency, or are they sort of an information and collection and supporting agency? You know, I mean, what do
Yeah,
you
that
think?
item C seems like it's a reporting agency.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this and then combined with what we saw earlier, it sounded like it was pretty clear kind of the purpose of the DOE, and it didn't involve enforcement. I actually
Right.
did just a brief search through the law for the word enforce, and I think it showed up like 4 times. Twice was here, and then twice was when they were transferring some of the authority from, I think it was like a proper enforcement agency, but it had to do with loans. Like it had to do with like collecting loans or something. And that was
Hmm.
like the only time that word had showed up. The Office of Civil Rights and then like loans. The only thing that I could see this tying to in terms of enforcement has to do with this purpose one, like strengthen the commitment. Again, even that's sort of distancing yourself,
Right. To
but
strengthen,
strengthen the
to
commitment,
enforce versus to strengthen, very
to
different.
strengthen the commitment, you know, to ensure access to education, equal educational opportunity. Maybe it feels like a
Yeah.
stretch. Yeah. So, okay. So what did we just establish? Like we established the kind of the base, the foundation. This is at minimum by law what they are to do, right? So now let's go read this report and go see what they're actually doing. So let's look at this report that the DOE publishes to summarize their work. Again, specifically, this is the Office for Civil Rights. The DOD also has to, by law, I ran into this when I was looking through the law. They also have to produce a report, and that's the agency financial report. This one's about 222 pages long. I could have drilled through that one. Kind of looking at it, they had some strategic goals and, aligned with it, what laws that they should and shouldn't be doing. And there seems to be a solid delta there, kind of when I was just doing a first glance. But, for this episode, though, I was trying to get as concrete as possible to illustrate exactly like what people there are physically doing, not kind of these abstract ideas of strategically where do we want to go. And that sort of led me to the Office for Civil Rights report. That's one reason, but honestly, the real reason is that I'm retracing the breadcrumbs on sort of my whole research journey, and the journey took me to this report. And this other one, the agency financial report, I kind of discovered at the very end. So, maybe we could do this one for a later date, but I just kind of wanted to keep drilling down to a sub
Yeah.
office. All right, so here's the report they have for 2023. I guess 2024 will come out next year. They have these every year. And I kind of marked it up with some comments. So let's go through and let me just kind of highlight some of the comments. It's obviously, it's a 50-page report. We're not going to go through every page. I just kind of want to highlight a few things that I found. So for one, I kind of like to see this just to sort of make sure this is just kind of a good sanity check. This is the reason why we're doing it. It had to do with this law. Like we have to write this, and then we've just saw this earlier. So it's like, okay, good. I'm on the right track. I'm at the right department. I'm in the right place. Good quick sanity check makes me feel good. So they write here that the Office for Civil Rights vigilantly enforces federal civil rights laws in schools and other recipients of Department of Education federal funding throughout the nation. They resolve case investigations. They publish policy resources. They provide school and community technical assistance. They collect and report data, and they manage and sustain an expert staff working in 12 regional offices. So I got to say, it didn't take me very long reading this report to kind of get through listing out what they're actually doing.
Yeah. First line, they are enforcing.
So they consider themselves an enforcement agency. I mean, that's how I don't know how much more clear you can get here. Let's go into kind of some of these other kind of neat things that I found. Again, the first thing that they do, and I would kind of expect this from a department that's always aware that perhaps funding could go away. I think it's natural for everyone running a department or an office to explain why they are the most important one or why their work is critical. And you can kind of, they hint at that at the first sentence. They say the OCR confronted the highest volume of complaints in our history, right? Receiving 19,000 of these things, which represents a 2% increase over the previous year, right? And then, we did a whole
Record
bunch.
high last year as well.
So many complaints.
I wonder what 2021 was like.
I know, or 2024, is it going to get better? I don't,
New record, new year,
it's
new
like, I
record.
don't, so there's more discrimination going on here. Civil rights is getting worse. Is that the conclusion?
Yeah.
And then they,
What is a complaint, I guess, but yeah.
well, let's look at some of these complaints. But then they also sort of elaborate on some of the other work that they do here. They publish policy resources and guidance. They, quote, developed revised regulations, which, should sound alarm bells to what we were just talking about earlier. It's not,
Right.
not what you're supposed to be doing. They implemented optional opt-in, mediation, blah, blah, blah. All right. So they're kind of, okay, fine, trying to get more efficient. That was a project. They recruited new staff, which they decided to put on here as something that they did over the last year.
Hey, I mean, you got to deal with all those complaints.
Which you notice I didn't highlight because I was like, what's this? But it's a good point. Hiring new people is not typically like an accomplishment that you would put into like a year-end report. I don't want to crap all over the DOE, okay, but like it has to be said.
Like if you're a revenue producing business, we made more money to hire more people and we made more jobs. We beg for more taxpayer dollars. And
this doesn't even say that they and you'll see later that the actual number of people didn't necessarily go up. All they're saying is like they trained 60 people.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
60 new staff after the other ones retired.
Or whatever, yeah. And then they respond to FOIA requests. So again, keep in the back of your mind what we just read in terms of the law, like what they have to do and what they're actually doing. This is kind of interesting. So, they consider themselves to be a enforcement agency. Again, the vigorous enforcement of civil rights laws. And then they kind of do me a favor and they actually list out specifically what those laws are. So you can see those here. And this is kind of how they organize the rest of this report. So, they'll have a section, for example, on Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, Title IX, which you're familiar with. They'll have a section on that and all the cases and stuff that they went through there. Okay, so this was interesting. So now they're actually going to break down the number of complaints which was filed by them. And they had the 19,200 that we saw earlier. And they said that was up from the previous year. But then they make a point to call out the fact that a single individual had filed 5,590 complaints in the year, right? So they're filing 15 a day. What is that? I mean, what are we talking about here? There's 5590. 15 a day. They're just pumping through these these complaints. And the thing is, they didn't even. It's included, and it's like, what are these? 15 complaints a day, and then they go ahead and say, "Oh, well, the high volume altered the ratio." It's like, yeah, no shit.
What
is this chunk just should not be there. So it's
and then what was that person doing the previous year? Is this just
I want to that's one of my takeaways here. I want to drill into these. I want to drill into these complaints. Anyway, I thought that was interesting. I mean, it's one of these things where it's like, okay, the number of complaints continue to rise, more complaints, more evidence of necessity. I get all that, but are we also saying that discrimination has increased over the Biden years or something? Has
complaints have increased?
Yeah, the complaints have increased exactly. Is something else going on? What's going on here? And it bothers me that they didn't seem to stress.
One person did 5,000.
Yeah. Anyway, so that's a red flag. I don't know what that is. And the other thing I wanted to pull here, and another point, they have 556 full-time staff, and they're kind of complaining that they got a lot more work, and despite the fact that the number of complaints have gone up. The number of staff continues to go down. They had 1,100 in 1981. Now it's down to 556. This, I think, is kind of a big deal. This other thing I have, the amplifying the impact, the notable outreach and collaborative activities. So if you remember in 2023, this was when the Supreme Court came down with the decision. It's right here. They write it here. Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard and the University of North Carolina. And what they remember that one where they limited the use of race in selective college admission programs. Now this is kind of the point of Elon and Vivek's idea, and something that I'm sort of alluding to. They wrote, in the weeks following the decision, OCR participated in the Department of Education's National Summit on Equal Opportunity in Higher Education, which the department hosted to highlight strategies that institutions of higher education are employing to promote diversity in higher education consistent with the law. Now, I didn't include like pulls from here, but I did when I did go and I actually pulled the report. Like I kind of got to see what they were talking about. This is public. They actually start listing down the actual names of them down here. I think it's this one that you can go and find. And honestly, in my reading, go find it and read it yourself. What it sounded like they were doing was guiding universities into how to shirk the decision. So like, how do you get the result that you want, but still align with the court's decision?
Right. Yeah. It said
so I think one of the ways that they talk about saying is, okay, you can't obviously choose one person over another because of their skin color, but you can, based on the application, choose. So if in the application a person writes, oh, I'm a such and such background, and because of this I was discriminated against, then it's fair game. Then you can say, yeah, because that's to the individual's experience. Stuff like that. I mean, they were providing this kind of guidance. We're starting getting to the territory of like interpreting laws and almost, telling as a department, as the executive branch of the government, sort of training or showing how to avoid the decision and sort of end up in the place that we want them to get to. That's not right.
Like the other interesting thing, like at this point, like I feel like I still don't have a good sense of what they actually do. Like, fine, they're promoting these things around a certain court state or something, but what?
So we'll show you. I mean, they go through basically these complaints. A lot of their work has to do with this enforcement idea, and they'll get these complaints and then they'll investigate them. And the highlight here, the point that I wanted to make here is like, and really the rest of this report. So we're only on page like 17 of 50. Pretty much for most of the rest of the report, they go and they illustrate like real cases and kind of what they did and the investigation and what they recommended happening. I got to say, they're like really bad. Like there's some really bad stuff that they have to run into. So, I don't want to sound as though I'm like against the office or the principle of the office or anything like that. Okay. I'm looking at this, exclusively from the angle of like, legally, can we cut this? In principle though, obviously this, you should read some yourself, but these are pretty bad. But the way in which they enforce it, and they sort of alluded to it earlier. Yeah. So the way in which I think that the enforcement works, it's not like, they're not going to kick your door in with guns and stuff and throw you in jail. That's not their method of enforcement. They write that the office safeguards the rights of students through the investigation of possible violations of civil rights laws. It's just, I think through investigation, they sort of are able to apply pressure. And they sort of make reference also to, they only have jurisdiction over those, education facilities that accept federal money, which is something that we sort of are aware to. So that implicitly implies, we're going to cut off the funds or something. I think those are the ways of the enforcement.
But do they have the power to actually cut off funds?
That's another good question. I don't know the answer to it. I wanted to know, like, how much this cost. How much did this, what are we talking about here? And I went back to the kind of this USA spending, which, if you're a regular follower of this program, um, hi mom, you've probably seen this before. But basically, we're looking at, all agencies that kind of show, 9.3 trillion, Department of Education, 254 billion, and drilling down just into this office, they're talking about 140 million, which is not bad, frankly. I did just a quick sanity check. We saw earlier that there are about 550 people for the budget. That came out to be like, 250,000 per person, which feels kind of, we seem to be in the right ballpark. Maybe you have a salary plus taxes and stuff for like I don't know, 100,000 K per person on average, and then the rest of the money going to other expenses or something.
That still seems pretty high, though, doesn't it?
I mean, my expectations are so low that the fact that we're like still in the millions is already kind of like, oh, thank goodness. This wasn't billions of dollars to basically make that report and investigate those.
Yeah, because it's like, salaries aren't the only thing, but this also doesn't sound like a very, beyond people resource intensive.
Yeah, right. We're not building anything. So, I don't know about you, but this exercise, I think I managed to learn a lot. But as is usually the case with these sort of deep dives, I came away with more questions than answers. Some of the recommendations I would have is, first off, I want to drill down into these complaints, like 5,000 from a single person. Come on.
Yeah, what is that?
Why are they growing year over year? They were able to, how legit are the bulk of these things? Some certainly are. And the report certainly made sure to highlight those. But is the DOE's goal to get more complaints so that they can put it at the beginning of every report each year? There's some incentive thing going on here that I would want to look into. The next question I had is, is this an enforcement agency? That seems strange to me. On the one hand of the bill, they make it very clear that that education is the responsibility of the parents and the states. The DOE is not going to increase the authority of the federal government over the state's education system. And, there must be some tension there with regards to the states. So one of the things that I would like to see, I would want the courts to issue a decision of some kind to the extent to which the DOE could apply force, whether through investigations or recommendations or what I think they can do in terms of threatening to withhold funds or grants or whatever onto universities, schools, and individuals. And I think, to force the issue, again, here, President Trump, we could have the office just be closed. And then the DOE would get sued. The president would get sued, or the administration would get sued, and the court would then have to answer the question. This question as to what can the DOE do? I suspect this is more kind of in line with how Elon and Vivek might work. Delete, 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 and then if something breaks, you put it back. It's quick, it's effective, although admittedly it's kind of messy. And again, specifically, I'd want a court ruling to interpret that section 203B1, like when it mandates writing a report that summarizes the compliance and enforcement actions. Is that enough legal language to make them an enforcement agency? And then kind of the corollary to that is I would want a better understanding of how, if the DOE didn't exist, how the laws would be enforced. So I imagine complaints might go to the police or something. Or like, the DOE might collect them and then forward them somewhere else, or like filters through the ones that don't make any sense, like the 5,000, whatever, from one person, and then, forward kind of the rest of them along or something. But they wouldn't be like they wouldn't be doing their own investigations. So kind of another point, I would question the legality even of the DOE publishing those policy guidance documents, how to understand the law, or worse, how to shirk them. That's really the role of the courts. There is nothing that I found in the law that said the DOE could interpret laws. So I would delete those publications and those who write them. And then I would probably close. We kind of briefly just scrolled over it, but they had 12 regional offices. Not sure why they need that much office space. And I know that the secretary has the authority to get rid of those. So what do you think? Do you take my recommendation?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm still fixated on the question, like, what does this organization do that a non-governmental organization does not have the legal ability to? It says they enforce things, but they're fielding complaints, giving legal advice, and collecting data and publishing reports. Where's the where's the enforcement? So it's like, back to your point, from the or back to your starting point, is that what's the minimum viable piece needed as permitted by the law? It's These things just sound so vague. Like, without some of these activities, are schools going to close down overnight? I don't think so. It's left to the states, right? Or am I?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's funny you mentioned that because I remember when I was in grad school and I was with these professors. It was in a New York grad school and very liberal. And the professor, they were basically scaring the students away from any sort of Republican policies. And one of them had to do with deleting the Department of Education. And then students were sort of asking, well, okay, well then they associated that with, we're going to be getting rid of education in general for everyone.
Right.
And that's wrong. Hey, I got a warning here that my battery's about to die on the camera. So let me just get through this last.
Okay.
Um, so the final thought I wanted to leave you with was the impression of how unbelievably vast the job of DOGE is going to be. So like we drilled down very deep into one tiny corner of the whole federal government. So like we barely even scratched the surface of the DOE. The other thing I'd want to drill into in the DOE is how do they, administer loans, and I'd want to dig into that another time. But just to kind of go back up the rabbit hole, we're just down here, right? These case investigations that we were looking at, and sort of the other things that we saw that the Office of Civil Rights was doing. But just within the Department of Education, they have all these other offices, which probably have a whole nother list of all this stuff that they're doing. And then if you go like a level higher in the Department of Education, you got, energy, and they're going to have a whole nother org chart there. And Health and Human Services is going to have a whole nother thing there. And there's probably another couple layers to those. Trump gave Musk and Vivek until July 4th, 2026, which is the US's 250th birthday to figure this out. And I think they've got a lot of work to do. And I'm looking forward to watching it all play out.